Today on the show, I have the pleasure of speaking with Matt Ryan from Re-viv. Now, Matt's passion in life is building companies that tackle socioeconomic issues through entrepreneurship. He strongly believes in the ability of the private sector to solve society's most complex problems and that entrepreneurs are at the foundation of all of it. Now, Re-viv is on a mission to solve the problem of affordable, accessible housing that's close to job centers while yielding market rate returns for investors. So I'm really pumped and excited to have Matt on the show today to share his incredible experience and his knowledge in the affordable housing space. But enough of me. Let's get him out here. G'day, Matt. Welcome to the show. How you doing today, mate?
Doing great, buddy. How about you?
Oh, I'm doing great. We're just having a little bit of chat in the background for those people who are not following us on YouTube. Matt's got a little surfboard in the background. We're just talking. Do you get out much in the San Francisco Bay? I know there's that weird wave that sometimes at the right swell goes underneath the bridge there. It's a nice left-hander.
Yeah, I joke with everyone. Don't let the surfboard fool you. You know, that's not even a hard top. That's a soft top. So I am a terrible surfer. It's great exercise. I love getting out in the ocean, but here in San Francisco, we're a little limited on storage space for stuff like that. So at the end of the day, it made a good prop. And, I'd say I probably play the instruments behind me more than I actually get on the surfboard. But yeah, it's one of those things I'd like to do more of and actually get good at. But it's been a challenge. I actually enjoy paddle surfing a lot, and I've done it in Hawaii. But it's a big investment and a big undertaking, right? So I haven't quite had to be able to edge the time out for that.
My few things in life I like, keeping fit, getting good sleep, eating well, but surfing is my sort of return to nature. So I try and surf once a week. I'm a big avid surfer. The whole reason I live in Los Angeles is because I can surf. And so I'm planning on going to Sayulita here for my birthday coming up and trying to get to Bali at sometime this year for a surf trip.
Fantastic. Yeah, I've heard about that. Yeah, see, fly fishing, backcountry camping, those are my two jams. That's how I release. So.
Love it. Well, enough about our backstories. I want to get into it. Can you, the first question I ask all my guests when they come on the show is, can you rewind the clock and tell me how you made your first ever dollar as a kid?
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking about this with an investor yesterday at breakfast. We were kind of sharing those initial stories. And I remember I was maybe just start to being in high school or in junior high, and a buddy of mine was kind of bragging about how much money he made in his lawn business. And I was broke. My parents, they gave me a little bit allowance, but never enough. And I said, you know what? If he can do it, I can do it. Right. Which is really kind of, interestingly enough, that mentality has kind of carried me through my career. And so I went around knocking door to door, probably knocked on 100 homes, got 6 clients for that summer and just serviced those clients for the entire summer. I borrowed the yard tools from my dad, and had a push mower, didn't even have a big fancy riding mower like he did. And, loaded it up in my back of my Ford Explorer. And that was my first hustle, and just kind of taught me, what it takes to just kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get out there and get business and then service that business. And it was a great experience for me.
I doing that sort of blue collar hard yakka, as they say in Australia. I remember tying steel and building pools in the summer in Australia, and it's freaking hot down in the 6 to 10 feet below the surface, and just thanking whoever the hell's up there that I was going to university, and eventually not going to have to be not that there's anything wrong with labor, being a laborer, but like that there was I was using more than just my physical skills, physical labor to make an earning. So walk us through the journey of how you got into Re-viv. Clearly there's probably some sort of backstory before you get into entrepreneurship. So what was it, and what does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I watched my father work corporate America for 25 years. And, I was young enough but also old enough to kind of see and hear about his struggles. And so in 93, he actually moved down to South Carolina where I grew up. We were in the Midwest at the time and moved around, almost 4 times just to accommodate his job. And he got the opportunity to go out on his own and work. He worked for International Truck and Engine Company, and he got the opportunity to take over a bankrupt dealership. And he was so miserable with corporate that he's like, I'm just going to take this chance. And he worked there for an entire year before he moved our family down to South Carolina. And, I say for me, my entrepreneurial journey started watching him, with the freedom that he got, the wealth that he was able to create, but really just the freedom that he created and the ability to create kind of his own brand. He had struggled working for corporate, the bureaucracy that existed there. He's always kind of been a freewheeling guy, no BS, shoot you straight. And, those things didn't always navigate in the corporate space, and so for me, I kind of kept that entrepreneurial spirit within my own endeavors. I went back and worked for him for 3 years. I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do. He kind of threw me into the deep end on some stuff, and I was looking for a career at that point. And I actually got into energy efficiency and green building sector because I found out that, I got interested. I've always been an environmentalist. I got really interested in this local controversial coal plant, and I remember reading the story of, hey, a 3% reduction in energy usage would mitigate the need for this controversial coal plant. And I'm like, that can't be that challenging, right? And at the time, Secretary Chu of under the Obama administration, they were doing a lot of initiatives and funding for studies of energy efficiency and implementing energy efficiency measures in residential and commercial buildings. And they was supposed to couple along with solar and clean energy generation. This was demand side, solutions. And it was supposed to be a very blossoming industry that would also help kind of resurrect this very distressed construction industry of 09 and 010. So I dove full in. Went to South-Based Energy Institute in Atlanta. I passed all my certifications in 6 months. I started cold calling on local builders, residential builders, doing Energy Star certification. And 3 months later, I landed my first contract. And I moved up to Charlotte to locate the business there. And, within 4 months, the contract that was supposed to go for 9 months to a year completely ran out. And I had to sink or swim. And I built the company into profitability after 3 years. But I was cutting my teeth in every direction, just trying to make stuff work. The industry hadn't really taken off. We were kind of becoming glorified subcontractors, in addition to consultants. And other people had tried to grow and scale that type of business. I came out to San Francisco to meet one of them around 2015. I'd been in the business for about 5.5 years and was kind of trying to figure out my next move. I started buying real estate along the way. I bought it for, a short sale condo in Charlotte. And it was maybe right around that time or just a year before I had bought a foreclosed duplex. So fast forward, basically the industry, I said, I don't think this is where I want to go. I got to find something else. So I moved to San Francisco. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I had tried to raise capital for that endeavor. I said, I want to start companies and raise capital, and that's what I want to do. And I'm going to go to the epicenter to do it. And I always joke with people that, I'm the only idiot who moved to San Francisco to actually start a private equity company versus, a VC-backed startup in technology. But it really came to fruition because of my experience in the duplex that I bought. There was a community member there. Her name was Miss Pam. She lived 2 doors down from us, and she actually worked at my now stepdaughter's school. And she walked to school every day where she was the chef. She, this duplex that I bought was in a very up and coming, call it gentrifying neighborhood. She took the bus every night to her second shift to take care of her granddaughter. And one night, my wife and I got talking about it. We said, hey, well, what happens to the Miss Pams when more people start moving into this neighborhood and buying up properties and trying to flip them and maybe pushing her out? And that was kind of my first, identity with displacement and gentrification. So I wrote out a 1-pager. I got a meeting with a local developer through a friend of a friend. Excuse me 1 second. I've been battling a cold. And I took it to him and he said, this is great. This is a fantastic idea. I called it the Miss Pam Project. I wanted to revitalize this neighborhood, but I wanted to do it in a way that was cognizant of the existing members while also providing, kind of for-profit solutions and, tailoring to the new people coming into the market, right? Everyone's seeking affordable rents, which is not uncommon. And he said, Matt, this is a fantastic idea, but you got to understand that you need to make a return for your investors. If you can balance that, and you can balance what you're trying to accomplish, you're going to be successful beyond, your imagination. And I didn't know it at the time, fast forward 12 months as I was trying to navigate a career, then, but that was the genesis. That was Re-viv, right? And so we fast forward into that, and I dove into that very quickly. We went in the value add space. That was kind of our initiative, that was kind of our initial piece is we were going to tackle, I call it the social side of value add investing. To save time, we came up against a lot of market forces that kind of, we had to put that on hold. And so it was kind of like, what's the next thing for us that really fits in our thesis, right? What's the next kind of product or idea that we can launch? And that's when we went into co-living. And frankly, we've never kind of looked back from there. We've been aggressively pursuing that since about 2019.
That's an incredible story. Where in South Carolina did you grow up?
Columbia.
Okay. I mean, I've just bid on 3 deals down there, actually. I just bought a 281 units in Greenville, South Carolina. Really like that market down there.
Oh, Greenville's fantastic. In 15 and 16, when I was just getting started, I didn't have the muscle, or the power to do it yet. I was looking at deals in Greenville. It was one of those markets that I thought was just going to,
Good little X factor.
Yeah. And I just didn't have, I've always had a good intuition for market selection, but I just didn't have the infrastructure in place to take down those deals yet. So it's a big what if for me. I'm happy you got in. It's a killer market.
Yeah, it's a great little market, and we keep looking. Actually, it's affordability play that we're doing. We don't need to talk about that. But on just slightly another note, there, have you ever heard of Cameron Cole, the energy efficiency company that goes around to major? My wife used to work for them back in the day, and she's actually in environmental science and do these energy audits for larger companies to determine where they can cut costs. Right. So just thought that you might have come across it, but on our side of the RSN, on an investment side, like one of the basic things we always do, particularly in older buildings, is it's such a great ROI is replace all the toilets with low flow toilets, low flow shower knobs. And it's such an easy way to prove that you spend $100,000, it could save you $20,000 to $40,000 a year in NOI. That's on a 5 cap. That's a incredible value add. But there is so much inefficiency in and around, the building sector.
Yes.
Right? I come from structure. I'm a structural engineer. I've built a lot of stuff here in California. A lot of people are trying to move to this like Katerra, which obviously went bankrupt, if you know who they are. Like this sort of this in a box in a warehouse sort of manufacturing, because there's a lot of waste that's produced with building products. But then you have the older aging communities that we buy with the HVACs and the inefficiencies and energies and the insulation and trying to still provide that affordable housing without having to take on a $10 million project on a $10 million investment, right? And 281 units I bought in Greenville, South Carolina, we paid $35 million for that. I'm going to probably spend $5 million revitalizing that asset, but it's not going to hit all the windows and the insulation. And there comes a point where you got to look at what's going to move rents that's still affordable, that can still get an ROI to an investor. So I'd be interested in coming with that guise of energy efficiency. Just before we get into the Revive stuff, what's your thoughts on how we become more efficient as buildings are continuing to age, right? And you're getting to a point in some markets where the existing asset is more expensive than brand new build, but to go through the re-entitlements and all that sort of stuff. So how do you go and breathe new life into a 50-year-old asset that's going to last for another 50 years? Yeah,
I mean, going back to the work that I did as call it a trade as a sub, we were kind of glorified building scientist, right? Mm-hmm. So we were looking at energy efficiency, comfort, indoor air quality, and durability. Those were kind of the 4 components. And it relayed itself into this other value of what we consider just high performance construction, right? Pulling all those sub trades together, the insulator, the air sealing, just a fancy term for sealing up cracks and crevices, reducing the number of conditioned air that escapes from a building. Really interesting trade, very difficult to train and implement, right? And so there's putting all that together, right? As a subcontractor, it's very, very challenging. And that's what we were kind of hoping to do. But it's very difficult because, as you mentioned, there's consumers who are like, well, yeah, I'm going to save $75, but are you going to solve my problem? And that's where we were kind of experiencing, was like we were solving people's problems and there was value there, but they didn't want to overspend to save $50 on a utility. And it brings me back to another issue, which is you don't pay your tenants' utility bills, right? So what's the incentive for you? You do the water fixtures because you probably pay the water bill, right? And so there's a savings to you. So there's always been a disaggregation between the tenant who pays the utility bill and the developer who implements. And so we've started to implement programs. Fannie and Freddie have a green mortgage program There's C-PACE financing, which allows you to go in and basically finance these improvements and do it onto your property tax bill, which then carries through title if you transfer it. So that owner doesn't endure all that cost. And those mechanisms are there, but they haven't reached scale, right? And so I think we haven't reached scale because there hasn't been the right incentives to, create enough profit extra for an investor to say, hey, this is worth my time, energy, and effort. And you're right, there is still an incredible amount of waste. And, air quality and comfort, those are important elements to a tenant experience. And I think as we continue to implement more, strict building codes, that's kind of the other problem too, is like, we don't like mandates. We like incentives as investors, right? That we hopefully can kind of clear the path for more implementation and advanced building practices. But you're right, there's a huge gap there. And a lot of it's just education. And we spend a lot of time educating tract home builders of like, yeah, this costs more, but how much time are you spending on callbacks because you're trying to install one HVAC system on a 3-story building versus installing 2? Right. And what is that? What's the value to your tenant? What's the value of all your time that you're spending now diagnosing and troubleshooting this because you maybe didn't design your HVAC system correctly, or you went a little skimpy and tried to do one system when the system really needed 2, or maybe a system in a mini split, and so there's always that cost that you don't see down the road that investors haven't really pinned that down as an industry, and we still had a long way to go. And that all the problems that you're talking about is kind of the reason I said, hey, I'm just going to take my knowledge and expertise and use this to implement in my projects, and I know it's going to benefit me and put my product above the rest. But there's often instances where we're paying more, and there's probably not a direct ROI in that, or at least a tangible one, right?
Like I can think of 2 assets I own right now, both with boiler chiller systems, right? And they're built in the 70s, and they're coming up to 50 years old. And you're like, does it make? We've got the HVAC lines from the boiler chiller that are causing issues, so we've got to go replace that. That's $300,000 or $400,000. Is there come a point where you just go and flip the whole system to being individual HVAC, and where you put it, is it on the roof, is it on the ground? And it's like, does that even give me an ROI? Does that increase the rents? It doesn't increase the rents, but it will save the next buyer from having to go and troubleshoot all that crap, and you're boxed in that issue. But there's so many aging buildings out there. You can't just keep going and knocking down and rebuilding and knocking down and rebuilding. You have to at some point revitalize, and that's where those programs are so vital for investors like me, where I'm like, well, I don't see an ROI right now, but maybe if I could get my taxes abated or something like that, I will go and invest in this community and do the windows and do the HVAC and stuff that doesn't move the rent, but helps prolong that life, the building's life, and maybe that building's going to continue to be a quote unquote affordable or workforce housing, call it sub $1,500 rents. Then maybe I'll be more incentivized to do it. So I think, and the other thing you didn't mention is like, it's so fragmented. Each county, each state, each city is so different. You go to South Carolina, they've got a different viewpoint to than San Francisco, right? So, are they that incentivized to do stuff?
And interestingly enough, there's more of a demand in, California is overly stringent in all these things. Northern California has one of the most mild climates of anywhere in the country. Right. South Carolina is an extreme climate, right? You've been there before. It is extremely high humidity, and we get down to 25 degrees. It needs it the most, right? Because there's so much energy intensity there because of what you have to cool and all those things. And yeah, I mean, the other instance, without going too far in it, is, do you install a window HVAC unit in the wall for value add? And we have standalone gas heaters that are kind of legacy, or do you endure the cost of a mini split and then do multiple heads? And we did a system where we did the HVAC and then we did an in-wall plug-in fan system, and that helped carry, that cooling load into the other bedroom. But after you look at the life cycle of the in-wall heaters, no one wants to replace them. And then the AC units, even the nice quality ones for $400 or $500, $600, you get 3 years out of them best. So that's where you come back. Remember, I said the fourth prong is the durability component. And it's not just the durability of the material, it's the durability of the mechanical system that you're installing. And there's just not enough information, kind of putting that all together. And in a second life, maybe I'll have some time to revisit some of those things.
Well, it's my next question was going to be, and I want to move on from this, but it's just like, it seems like you got jaded by it, right? You couldn't find solutions, and but it's such a need there. So I know we can't solve the problems today on this show, but it's for those people listening. It's like there needs to be progression as investors that we're buying existing deals to provide that affordable workforce housing. How do we solve for it? And I don't have the answer, right? I don't pretend to have the answer. I'm an investor. You're an investor. We're a housing provider, but I do know some of these places need a ton of work. And I ain't putting my hand up all the time to do it because it just doesn't make sense from because I've got a fiduciary responsibility to my investors.
Well, it's like everything else. You can have all the right equipment, and this was our big mantra too when we did it. The right equipment is nothing without the right installer, and that's where you unless you have that, it doesn't matter what you buy, what incentives you put in. You got to have the people who understand the systems and understand the building as a whole. And that's still where we struggle as an industry, that old industry that I was in. And that would be the jadedness that I say I have, is that we just, it wasn't conducive, to growth.
Right. Well, let's now pivot into Revive, and you there seems like a couple of iterations. You mentioned market forces earlier. So talk to a little bit about what you encountered that made you stop what you originally had set out to do.
Yeah, we wanted to create a tenant-focused, retention model that we could scale for value-add investing, right? Keeping tenants, doing the necessary upgrades, implementing the energy efficiency and green building measures we talked about. And we kind of put to pro forma together that when you factored in construction costs, leasing cost, and vacancy costs, that if we could get to a rent escalation, to sign a 2-year lease with someone with a pretty steady rent escalation, sometimes 15, 18%, maybe more, but we would provide code level upgrades. A lot of these apartments, the conditions of a lot of things were extremely aged, right? Carpet, bathroom fixtures, you name it, vanities. Not everyone wants granite countertop. They just want these things to function, right? And so we could make the necessary code level upgrades, keep them in, and not have to worry about displacing people as part of our plan. And, there's two main factors. Sacramento passed rent control shortly after, which in my opinion, it's not a good policy. It's not conducive to the things that we were trying to create, which is, okay, we're taking an equity hit here, on these things. But if we had, say, a debt provider that could come in and give us 75 basis points, like a Fannie Freddie on top of this to help finance and close the gap on the loss to lease that we have because of what we're doing, could that incentivize more developers to focus on tenant retention instead of displacing people? Okay. Or could we get a property tax abatement for doing that? And there's models that kind of exist, but they typically exist for a larger scale. And we see a significant need in this, under 50 unit, right? The majority of the apartment buildings in the United States are actually that size, right? They're mom and pop owners. So it's like, what are we incentivizing, and call it to steal a term from Daniel Perelik in Opticos, missing middle type value add. And so anyways, rent control through wrench in that. The macro conditions were exactly that. Everybody and their mother was getting into C and B value add. And so we were just seeing, again, we were trying to focus on a model that we're using a little bit less return for a little bit of goodwill, right? And something that we were trying to do different. And that if we scaled it, eventually we could get to a point where we could find that solution on the back end. And I just said, you know what? It's something, there's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of headwind here, especially with people going after these assets. What's another pivot? And it was around that time that Opportunity Zones was coming online, which we were using the Economic Innovation Group's data sets, because Revive, focused on revitalizing neighborhoods, was very core to their data, was very core to what we were trying to do. And so when we saw the O-zones and then we saw co-living on top of that as kind of an innovative approach to affordable housing, we said, man, this really makes sense. Maybe this is something that, is away from the herd enough that we can go after. And where we were seeing deals, people taking down value add deals that didn't even cash flow, a co-living deal, because you're getting a higher rent per square foot and a higher NOI. Now, all of a sudden, we could eke out a cash flow on a high barrier to entry market like a Sacramento or an Oakland and Berkeley that people weren't normally getting. So we thought there would be a lot of demand for this type of product. And that's ultimately why we pivoted.
Just quickly explain to the listeners what co-living is.
It's a rent and bedroom strategy where we're renting directly to, say, you as a prospective tenant, and we're furnishing the common areas. We're taking care of the utilities expenses for you. That's inclusive of your rent. We're including things like cleaning. There's scheduled community activities. I've heard of catering, you name it. But basically, it's a much more frictionless turnkey model to the we call it the Craigslist model, where people are moving into high density areas, cities with major, job producing cores, going into a 3, 4, 5 bedroom, trying to bring their rent down versus going and get a studio, right? That's been going on for decades. That housing type has existed for almost a century, right? Since the beginning of, and so, but now all of a sudden we have these operators moving in and making it very frictionless for these tenants. And so for the development side, there's become a robust demand for those types of properties. And that's essentially what it is.
Have you seen, when you say frictionless, issues with the product around having to share a common space and essentially have roommates? Like, has that been a big barrier in the projects that you've brought to market?
In my understanding, traditionally, no, it's not. People know what they're getting themselves into. And, hey, you're saving $250, $550 a month in rent. There's a reason why that is. You have to share something. There's always going to be friction amongst tenants. And, those are property management issues that arise. Hey, I'm not going to lie and say there's not a higher operating expense associated, a higher turnover expense. But Brad Haregraves, who's the chairman of Common, he's the largest, operator of co-living beds. He just did a great piece on his blog about how, even with an average tenancy of say 16 to 18 months, they're still maintaining 96 occupancy. They're beating if not in line with all the traditional apartment investors when it comes to occupancy and turnover and really holding strong on metrics, so it's, it's just kind of the nature of the beast. You got to know what you're getting yourself into and have a good operator in place.
Walk us through what the model of Re-viv looks like today. If, I'm an investor, or what are you doing? Walk me through an investment model.
Yeah.
Right now.
Right now, we're stabilizing our $13.5 million in portfolio across 3 properties, right? Actually 4. We just completed our 4th. And we're actively looking to continue to look for value add opportunities conducive to co-living setup, small scale co-living, under 50 beds, 20 at a minimum. But we also are trying to bring on equity partners to start building out a development pipeline, because frankly, trying to find existing assets for co-living is extremely challenging, right? Purpose-built co-living is really kind of the wave of the future. We feel like there's other systematic ways in which you can do housing, micro developments. That's another market segment of this kind of affordable by design market that's growing. And, we're very bullish on that for all the reasons and kind of the things we alluded to in our original thesis. And, for us, it's now like going from the 40 units to the 100 to the 1,000, right? And just continuing to be a leader in this, as a developer of co-living. And we feel like there's a pretty open runway for that.
Yep. No, I think I happen to share an office with a good buddy of mine, Beach City Capital, and he's doing I think it's a 50 unit co-living space in Mar Vista here. I've also sat in Hermosa Beach. We won't get into the politics of Hermosa Beach, but there's a bit of a pushback, a bit of NIMBYism going on with why are you bringing this dormitory style? It's essentially student housing for adults, right? And it's hostel living essentially, but on a nicer scale, and trying to get local cities to get on board. I have seen a bit of pushback. Have you found the same pushback in the markets you're targeting?
Yeah, I mean, so far the projects that we've taken on, we've converted, they're small scale. So we've either converted them to the existing residential zoning codes, right? And so that we look at projects that we don't have to go to a rezoning board, right? We don't have community input. Mm-hmm. So it's called, you've probably heard the term zoning by right.
Yep.
So we haven't had to do that thus far. When we go to redevelop assets, if we're buying raw land and redeveloping, which really wouldn't be our MO, but maybe we find a great deal that's to happen. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely headwinds. The nice thing is that there's zoning reform that's kind of sweeping the United States, right? The NIMBYs are getting called out. And the interesting thing that's happening is the majority of the zoning reforms that have already happened, like in LA and other areas, they're much more conducive to this type of housing, because the rent that you're delivering, that's where the term affordable by design comes from, is truly affordable. It's easy to, it's less difficult to sit into a community planning meeting and say, oh, but these are going to be luxury apartments, $4,000 a bedroom. And, we don't want this type of housing. This is luxury. This is only going to service the highest end, versus, well, this is housing that's going to be $1,500 a room. and available to people with 80 to 120 of the area median income. This is the retail worker who can't afford to live in Oakland or can't afford to live in Sacramento downtown right now if they were to rent a studio. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that a lot of the messaging around NIMBYism is against, call it more luxury housing, top of the market housing, but we're building housing without a tax subsidy at the bottom 15, 20% of the rental market. And it's going to be increasingly difficult for those people to stand there in the way of those projects when you got, again, that barista, that recent college grad saying, hey, I'm not opposed to this housing. And you're seeing that more and more of the younger generation mobilizing around the YIMBY movement, because frankly, the people who are standing in those meetings are the people that have owned a single family home and been there 15, 20 years. And I get that they don't want an apartment building built next to them, and that's an issue we'll avoid for today, right? But the fact remains that, we got 45 million Gen Zs hitting the marketplace over the next 10 years, over the next decade, and they're paying on average of 42 to 44% of their income to rent. And that's not sustainable. That's not the American dream. That's not what is going to make them a productive generation of the future. And they're already seeing similar headwinds that my generation, the millennials, saw coming out of 08, 09. We don't need to repeat those mistakes. And so I think for us, we've kind of got the narrative behind us. And I think that where I was trying to go with that is a lot of the zoning reforms are conducive to this type of housing, which I think is great.
I completely agree. And having a background in ground up construction as well, and just how difficult it is to try and get things built. Most major cities, who've got a lot of people, when people, arseholes, everyone's got one, like an opinion, right? And so when you bring a lot of people together and you go out to community opinion, which you need to do, which don't get me wrong, you do need to do that when you're getting your projects approved, but trying to get the buy-in from everyone when it's in the guise of community enrichment to try and make sure that the barista or the checkout gal or guy can have somewhere affordable to live is really quite important. And I think co-living is a step in the right direction. Hopefully not a band-aid step, back to what we were talking about earlier with the existing housing. You can't just keep building new stuff, because you're saying, the product to build it from scratch really is the only way to do it with co-living. So it's been an extremely interesting conversation, my friend. I can talk your ear off, and next time I'm in San Francisco, we should definitely meet up. But I guess where in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, where do you see Re-viv going to in terms of a platform?
Yeah, we want to continue to drive a truck through this co-living model, and we want to become a dominant player in that space. That's our, call it MVP, our minimum viable product. Once we get through that, I'd like to pivot back to our North Star, which is being a non-asset specific but area specific developer. I always tell people the whole premise of Re-viv is to go back to the Miss Pam's neighborhood. How do we turn that neighborhood around and make it conducive where we can keep her in the neighborhood but still provide housing? And being a for-profit developer, there's a nonprofit element to what we're doing that we would work with local agencies and governments to mitigate barriers for building all types of housing, very much a neighborhood specific approach for a host of reasons, right? And for us, from my perspective and my early thesis of Re-viv is that, being able to do that would mitigate some of the risk associated with real estate investing, which is you often get trapped in the macro cycle of whatever your sector is or segment is. And then you got capital, you don't make money unless you allocate capital, right? And what do? You're like, we either make money or we sit on our hands and we don't do anything and not make money. And so we got to get this capital allocated. And that's where people make mistakes, right? That's what creates these issues. And, for us, I still very much a big believer in that approach, not just for the social element, but for, the risk mitigation. And so navigating back to that North Star in time, I think would make sense. But, that's the one thing about a successful business is you got to have an MVP. You got to have something that you can just rubber stamp and print and dominate at. And that's what we're doing with co-living right now, because it just checks all the boxes for us.
I love it, my friend. Look, at the end of every show, we like to dive into the top 5 investing tips. Ready to get into it?
Sure, let's do it.
Mate, question number 1 is, what's the daily habit you practice to keep on track towards your goals?
Every single night, I try to flush out what's in my sauna projects, and at the very least, look at my Google Calendar and make sure that I have the next day planned accordingly, and that anything a meeting that I did or that I had that I didn't follow up on, or I don't have, make sure those things are plugged in. Because I think the worst thing you can do is go through your day meeting to meeting or interaction to interaction, not go in, record those things, do the proper follow-ups, and then do the same thing the next day, right? You're going to be incredibly ineffective. That to me is the biggest, ROI anyone can have, is just spend 15, 30, 45 minutes at the end of the day, get ready for the next day, be ready to wake up and kick ass and know that you got everything else the day before behind you.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Question number 2 is, who's been the most influential person in your career to date?
Yeah. I mean, I go back to my old man. He's been the guy who's inspired me across the way. Hearing his story, he was a mega commuter in Chicago, moving from the suburbs, drive till you qualify. There's so much about his story that's relevant to what we're trying to accomplish at Re-viv. I'd say second to that, my interaction with Miss Pam, we were never that close, right? She was someone who helped babysit and worked at the school. But, I'm very much inspired by those people who are everyday working people trying to make it, and then seeing larger social issues and policy issues that are having a negative impact on them. And, I'm very much inspired by, this idea of the American dream and upward mobility and creating more opportunity for people. And I love the fact that real estate, and where it's located and how it's built is very much conducive to all of that.
Yeah, completely agree with everything you just said there. Question number 3 is, what's the most influential tool in your business? Meaning, could it be a physical tool like a phone or a journal? Or is it a piece of software that you just can't run the business without? What is it?
I mean, I'm a real estate investor, right? So I'm a big music nut. And I remember listening to one of my favorite bands, Trey Anastasio of Fish, talk about his gear one time. And he talked about his old 80-year-old amp that he's had for decades, right? And he's like, as a guitarist, you really just got to know your equipment. You don't worry about getting the next fancy tool. Know your equipment. My equipment is my pro forma, man. It is my spreadsheet. It is what I dive into when I'm worried about something at 2:00 in the morning. I'm in the middle of underwriting a project. I know the ins and outs of that spreadsheet. I've built them, and so my financial modeling tools are, in my comfort with those tools and the ability to navigate them. To me, that's my spear at the end of the day that I really keep sharp. So
I love it. I'm completely the same way. It's sort of, someone asked me for mine the other day. I'm like, would McLaren or Red Bull or Ferrari give away their
recipe,
their recipe for driving fast cars in Formula One? No, they wouldn't. It's your Formula One racing car.
Yeah.
You've tweaked it to the cow sheds and back. So you're not going to give it away to anyone.
Yeah, for sure.
Question. We're up to question number 4. Number 4. In one sentence, what has been the biggest failure in your career, and what did you learn from that failure?
A value?
Failure. Like when you fail.
Failure.
My Australian accent keeps coming across.
Yeah. I did a LinkedIn post on this where I feel like I've been, quote, successful thus far, and hopefully that stays true in building a small boutique development company. My biggest failure in doing it is that I tried to do it all myself. And I look back on it, I wish I'd have found key partners. Now, I didn't have strong connections when I moved to San Francisco, right? I had to start all over again. But really, I wish I would have done something, either gone work for another developer, though, I kind of tried people, my buddy told me, you're not very employable, but I wish I would have found more key partners where I could have relayed my areas of expertise versus for the last 6-7 years becoming the jack of all trades, master of none. I think it's an incredibly inefficient way to start a company. I used to think that you could bootstrap a company. I wouldn't recommend trying to bootstrap a private equity company. Maybe you can do it if you're doing software and you're selling a widget, but it's just an incredibly hard business to get into. And I see a lot of people, because we have so many gurus out there saying, oh, it's, start a syndication company and apartment investment made easy. Maybe it's easy for those guys. It's been brutal for me, and it's been really tough. And I've had a lot of lumps along the way. And I really wish that I would have just kind of found a key partners and built a few key relationships and maybe, shared more of the pie at first and done it that way than trying to just, trudge through the mud on my own.
I love it. But in saying that, there is a element of when you're building any company, right? You have to wear all the hats in the beginning to understand who you need to go employ and what you're good at and what you're not good at. And it only comes with hindsight that you can look back and say, I wish I'd done that sooner. But you needed to go through those lumps because that's probably your journey, and that's the way you get to becoming a more efficient business owner and efficient entrepreneur. So
Yeah, and it's interesting because that's what my dad always taught me. He said, you need to understand all the facets of the business. And I like nuance. I like to argue both sides of the ball, right? So I agree with your sentiment. There's a lot of truth to that. Obviously, for me, I think you got to find a good equivocal balance where you're not putting yourself in situations where what you don't know is causing more and more headaches, right? Because that's the thing about real estate investing, and Howard Marks, I love his book. It's always the things you don't know that blow up in your face and really increase risk. And sometimes there's a wisdom out there that you haven't accrued yet, and
right.
That's where experience matters. So
that's exactly correct. Yep. Last question, mate, is where can people reach you to continue the conversation that'll be in your sphere? Where do they go?
Yeah, just go to re-viv.com. There's a Calendly link on there. You can book a call with me, set up a time to talk. You can look at our G Street deal, which is open. We keep that open so people can understand, the mechanics of a co-living deal. Talk to me about how we underwrite. We don't juice stuff and talk about high returns. We talk about our underwriting process and how we keep things simple, middle of the fairway. And, that's all there. And, schedule a call with me and we'll kind of walk you through what we do and how we're doing it, why we're excited about it.
Love it, mate. Well, look, I want to thank you so much for jumping on today's show. Just some of the things that I want to reflect back to you. I think the importance of having a socially aware development company as we start to see old buildings with your energy efficiency and the problems that I'm facing in my own portfolio morph into ways to provide housing in a way that is affordable to the average folk who need to live in certain areas. And it's not just a US problem. It's in Australia, it's in Europe, it's in Mexico, totally. It's in Canada, it's in Africa, it's all across, right? Affordable housing is always constantly going to be an issue. It's been an issue for the last 30 years, is going to be an issue for the next 30 years. So constantly trying to sharpen that tool, as you said, sharpen that spear before on your modeling with your pro forma, but also the way we think about how we provide housing or revitalize other existing housing, I should say. And then getting the buy-in from the local government, which is always tough. It's always challenging. So it's, we haven't solved anything on this podcast. We'll need to be speaking for many more years to be coming. But I think just having that conversation and talking openly about it is the place where we start to really start moving that needle or that ball down the fairway so we can get to our goal of providing that affordable housing for everyone. Did I leave anything out there?
No, I think you nailed it. And I think the momentum in what we're talking about, it's there. More and more developers, emerging developers, syndicators, private equity people. We're in an interesting time. We're in an exciting time for everything we're talking about. And I think the future is really bright for that. There's a ton of momentum around it. And, I love seeing that. It's truly inspirational. And I think we're going to solve a lot of these problems, in our lifetime. So
yeah, I do too. All right, mate. Well, look, thank you again for jumping on today's show. Enjoy the rest of your week and we'll catch up very, very soon.
My pleasure. Thank you, Reed.
Well, there you have another cracking episode, jam-packed with incredible episode with Matt. If you want to check out what he does, go over to revive.com. That's re-viv.com. Check out his G Street deal up there. It's an example of how he does co-living and walks you through all the underwriting tools, tips, and tricks to get into the co-living space and the returns that he provides to investors. I do really think this is an incredibly important topic that we're talking about. So if you do have any comments around this topic, please reach out to me at info@reedgoosens.com. I want to thank you all again for taking some time out of your day to tune in to continue to grow your financial IQ, because it's what we're all about here on this show. The easiest way to give back is to give it a 5-star review on iTunes, and we're going to do this all again next week. So remember, be bold, be brave, and go give life a crack.